Guys, we'll be continuing with my college football schedule preview and paint trade prediction videos. Today I'll be doing the Georgia Bulldogs. So Georgia's schedule is a little easier this year than it was last year because this year they don't play a big non-conference game besides their rivalry game against Georgia Tech. This year they get three easy games in the non-conference against Marshall, Austin P, and Charlotte. And it's good that they get to play all of Alabama, Ole Miss, and Texas at home because as tough as Georgia is to beat anywhere, they're even tougher to beat at home. Georgia has the longest current home winning streak. They've won 31 home games in a row, and they haven't lost a home game since 2019. But Georgia's schedule is still tough, but there are some more good things about it. Like they get to start the season with two given wins against Marshall and Austin P, which is a big help because they're going to have a new quarterback. But it's not an easy start to the conference schedule going on the road to play Tennessee. But the good news for Georgia is they've owned Tennessee. They've beat them 8 times in a row. But this, I think, will be Tennessee's best chance to beat Georgia in a long time because Georgia's defense has been the problem for Tennessee for so long. But I think this might be the worst Georgia defense in a long time. But I'm not saying that I think Tennessee will win this game. I don't think they'll win this game. But if Josh Heupel can't get this win this time, I don't really think he's ever going to beat Georgia. And it's nice that where they get their first week off in between Tennessee and Alabama. But like Tennessee has had a Georgia problem, Georgia's had an Alabama problem. And last year seemed like Georgia's best chance to beat Alabama because Alabama had just lost Nick Saban, and Alabama had lost a lot more from the year before than Georgia had, but they still couldn't get it done. And this year, Georgia loses more than Alabama does. And I think there's a good chance that Georgia's home winning streak comes to an end in this game. But then Kentucky, I know they gave Georgia a hard time last year because they had a good defense, and they may do it again this year. But Kirby Smart is not going to lose to Kentucky. He's not like Lane Kiffin is. And he's not going to lose to Mississippi State either. I know they gave Georgia's defense some struggles when they played last year, and they may do that again. But Kirby Smart will find a way to get the win in that one too. I'll just go ahead and tell you. And on the road at Auburn, it could be a challenge because Auburn is a tough place to play, so it may end up being pretty close. But Kirby Smart's not losing to Auburn with Jackson Arnold being the quarterback for Auburn. And then Ole Miss will be a tough game because they dominated Georgia last year, and even though Ole Miss loses a lot this year, Georgia does too. Georgia loses about as much as Ole Miss does. Both teams are going to have to rebuild their defensive line, but I would trust Georgia more to do that than I would Ole Miss, but this is probably going to be a pretty close game. And it's nice where their second bye week comes. It comes where it always has before the rivalry game against Florida. So Florida will be played in Jacksonville, Florida, where it's always been played, but just for one more year, and then they're going to be playing somewhere else for a while. But for the first time in several years, I think Florida actually has a chance to beat Georgia. I'm not saying I think they will. I don't think they uh, will, but they're the most even with Georgia this year, I think, than they've been in a long time. And Florida did give a much more experienced Georgia team than they will be this year a pretty tough time last year. And it's nice that Georgia gets to play Mississippi State, who's probably going to be a bad team in between Florida and Texas, because Texas is going to be a really tough one. This will be not only one of the biggest games in the SEC, but one of the biggest games in college football in the regular season, and so will the Alabama game and maybe even the Ole Miss game. But Texas, bad news for them is they're going to have to rebuild their offensive line that has been one of the best in the country the past two seasons that uh, got pushed around badly by Georgia's defensive line both times they played last year. But good news for Texas is Georgia has to rebuild their defensive line too. So I think this is going to be a really good one. And it's nice that Georgia gets to play Charlotte in between Texas and their road game against Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech, that game will be played on a Friday like it was last year. And for the first time in a long time, I actually think Georgia Tech has a chance to beat Georgia. I'm not saying I think they will, but Georgia Tech returns their quarterback, Haynes King, who ran all over Georgia's front seven, and Georgia's having to pretty much completely rebuild their front seven of the defense this year. And Georgia loses their quarterback Carson Beck, and if it hadn't have been for him making all of those great throws in that game, I do not think they would have been able to come back and win that game. Georgia Tech almost ended Georgia's home winning streak last year. And I think that game will be at least close. So for the point spread prediction, games in the green are games where I think Georgia will be favored to win by a blowout, 20 or more points. Games in the blue are games where I think they'll be favored to win by double digits, 10 to 19 points. Games in the purple are games where I think they'll be favored to win by about a touchdown, 6 to 9 points. Games in the pink are games where I think they'll be favored to win by about a field goal, 1 to 5 points. And there are no games where I think that Georgia will be a clear underdog. And the only games where I could see them possibly being the underdog are Alabama and Texas. Uh, but I think they'll probably be about a 1 point favorite in both of those because they're home games. But they would for sure be underdog if they were road games, and they'd probably even be an underdog on the road to Ole Miss. Uh, I think they'll be favored by probably about three against Ole Miss because it's a home game. And Marshall, I think Georgia will be favored by about 30 points at least. And Austin Peay and Charlotte, I think Georgia will be favored by like 40 points in both of those. And Kentucky and Auburn, I think the spread will be around 17. And Florida, I think the spread will be about 14. And Mississippi State, I think the spread in that one will be like 24 uh, points. And Tennessee, even though it's a road game, I think because of how much Tennessee has struggled with Georgia for so long, Georgia will still be favored by about 7 points. And that game. And Georgia Tech, because of Georgia's talent advantage, I think they'll be favored by about 8 points in that one. But Georgia, I think at worst case will split the games of Tennessee, Alabama, Ole Miss, Florida, Texas, and Georgia Tech, and go 9-3. Uh, because the Kirby Smart, I think, is just too good of a coach to do any worse than that. But this year, Georgia will not be considered a sure team to make the 12-team playoff. But I will still be picking them to do that. But I do think it's very unlikely that Georgia goes 12-0 this year. But that will be it with this video. Please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon.